In the next 60 seconds, you will check your phone approximately 4 times. In the next hour, you'll receive 23 notifications. In the next day, you'll switch between tasks 300 times, your attention fracturing like light through a prism, each fragment growing smaller and more scattered. But on April 11th, 1357, in the cloth-making town of Ypres, Belgium, a weaver named Willem van der Meer woke before dawn, walked to his guild hall, and spent 14 hours doing the exact same thing his grandfather had done and his grandfather's grandfather. He pulled the same threads, he sang the same songs, he broke bread with the same families, and when historians would later scour the records of that day, they would find it so unremarkable, so perfectly ordinary, that barely a sentence was written about it. It might have been the most boring day in history. It was also, perhaps, one of the most profound. By the end of this hour, you'll discover why our ancestors built entire civilizations around boredom and why their deepest wisdom might be exactly what your restless mind needs tonight. This isn't about productivity or optimization. It's about remembering what it feels like to belong to something larger than yourself, to move through time like water instead of lightning. These insights come from guild records dating back to the 12th century, merchant ledgers from medieval Florence, and the quiet testimonies of people who lived when boredom was not the enemy of a meaningful life, but its very foundation. Picture Willem's hands in the darkness before sunrise. Calloused from 20 years of the same motions, they know their way to the wooden loom without thought. The wool is coarse beneath his fingers, sheep from the hills outside Bruges, spun by women whose names he knows, whose children play with his children in the narrow streets after Sunday Mass. The guild hall smells of lanolin and beeswax, of oak beams seasoned by decades of the same breath, the same quiet conversations. 12 other weavers are already at their stations, their shuttles moving in rhythm like a heartbeat. No one speaks of deadlines or efficiency. There is only the work, and the work is enough. This is not the romantic medieval world of our imaginations, all castles and courtly love. This is the world of guilds, those strange, forgotten institutions that governed nearly every aspect of working life for over 500 years. The Guild of Weavers in Ypres had rules for everything. How long an apprentice must serve, 7 years. What prayers to say before beginning work, a blessing over the threads. How to share profits when times were lean, equally, always equally. And what to do when a member fell ill. His work continued, his family fed, his place held until he returned. Willem learned his craft not from a manual or a YouTube video, but from watching Master Hendrik's hands for 3 years before he was allowed to touch a shuttle. He learned the weight of good wool, the sound of tight weaving, the patience required to create cloth that would outlast the person who made it. But more than technique, he learned something we've almost forgotten, that mastery comes not from innovation, but from repetition, not from disruption, but from depth. The guild system wasn't just about making cloth or shoes or barrels, it was about making people. Each guild was a small society with its own laws, its own identity, its own way of moving through the world. Members lived near each other, married each other's children, buried each other's dead. They shared tools, techniques, and something far more valuable, a common understanding of what it meant to do work that mattered. In Ypres, the cloth that Willem and his guild brothers created was prized across Europe. Merchants would travel for weeks to purchase it, not because it was cheap or quickly made, but because it was incomparably good. The guild mark, a small symbol woven into each piece, was a guarantee that this cloth had been made by hands that knew their craft, in a place where quality mattered more than quantity, where the work itself was a form of prayer. What made the guild system so stable, so resistant to the chaos that defined much of medieval life? It wasn't efficiency. A modern factory could produce in one day what Willem's Guild made in a month. It wasn't profit. Guild members rarely became wealthy in the way we understand wealth today. It was something more fundamental, the architecture of belonging. Every guild member knew exactly where they stood. Apprentices served masters, masters served the guild served the town served the region served the kingdom, and the kingdom, in theory at least, served God. This wasn't a ladder to climb, but a web to inhabit. Your identity wasn't separate from your role, it was woven into it as tightly as the threads in Willem's cloth. Compare this to the Tang Dynasty in 8th century China, where artisans organized themselves into similar collectives called hang. A ceramics maker in Chang'an lived within the same intricate system of mutual obligation and shared mastery. Or consider the Islamic world of the same period, where the futuwa, brotherhoods of craftsmen, created networks of support and skill sharing that stretched from Cordoba to Cairo. Across cultures, across centuries, humans discovered the same truth. Meaningful work requires meaningful community. The guild system created what economists now call moral economies, markets governed not purely by profit, but by relationships, reputation, and responsibility. When a baker in medieval Paris charged too much for bread, he didn't just lose customers, he lost his place in the community that had raised him, taught him, and given his life meaning. The market was embedded in society, not separate from it. This embedding created something we've lost, the possibility of boring, beautiful days. Days when you woke up knowing exactly what you would do, who you would do it with, and why it mattered. Days when your work connected you to something larger than yourself, not through mission statements or company values, but through the simple fact that the cloth you wove would keep someone warm, the bread you baked would feed someone's family, the shoes you made would carry someone home. We've gained much in the centuries since Willem's time. We have choices our ancestors couldn't imagine, opportunities that would have seemed miraculous to them. But we've also lost something precious, the deep satisfaction of belonging to a tradition larger than ourselves, of mastering something completely, of moving through our days with the rhythm of ritual rather than the chaos of constant change. In fragmenting work from community, efficiency from meaning, innovation from tradition, we've created lives of infinite possibility and profound disconnection. We can be anything, do anything, go anywhere, and somehow, in all that freedom, we've forgotten how to simply be. Imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to wake up tomorrow and know exactly what you were going to do. Not because someone scheduled it for you, not because an algorithm optimized your calendar, but because you belonged to something, a craft, a community, a way of being in the world that had been tested by time and found worthy. Sarah Chen discovered this feeling by accident. A software engineer in Seattle, she had spent 5 years switching between companies, chasing stock options and career advancement, until one evening she found herself in a pottery studio. The clay was cold beneath her hands, and for the first time in years, she wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't optimizing anything. She was simply present, learning to center clay on a wheel the way potters had for thousands of years. That was 3 years ago. Now, Sarah spends her evenings in what she calls her modern guild, a group of 8 people who meet 4 nights a week in a converted garage. They're not all potters. There's a baker who makes bread the way his grandmother did in rural Italy, a carpenter who builds furniture with hand tools, a seamstress who creates clothes meant to last decades. They've created something that doesn't quite exist in our world, a space where mastery matters more than novelty, where the goal isn't to disrupt but to deepen. They share tools, techniques, and something harder to name, a way of moving through work that feels both ancient and revolutionary. When Marcus, the baker, kneads dough, his hands follow rhythms that connect him to bakers in medieval Paris, in ancient Rome, in every culture that has ever transformed grain into sustenance. When Elena sews by lamplight, her stitches echo the needlework of guild seamstresses who once gathered in workshops from London to Florence. But here's what makes their experiment both beautiful and fragile. They're swimming against the current of everything modern life teaches us. Our economy rewards speed over quality, novelty over mastery, individual achievement over collective wisdom. Sarah's company doesn't understand why she turns down promotions that would require more travel, more meetings, more time away from her clay. Her friends don't understand why she spends her free time playing with mud instead of building her personal brand. The obstacles are real. Distraction pulls at them constantly, phones buzzing with notifications, emails demanding immediate responses, the subtle pressure to be optimizing every moment. Marcus sometimes finds himself checking market prices for artisanal bread while his dough rises, calculating whether he could turn his passion into a side hustle. Elena catches herself photographing her work for Instagram instead of simply enjoying the meditative rhythm of her stitches. But perhaps the deepest challenge is philosophical. We've been taught that growth means change, that standing still is stagnation, that mastery is less valuable than adaptability. The guild mindset asks different questions. What if depth matters more than breadth? What if there's wisdom in doing one thing beautifully instead of many things adequately? What if the goal isn't to become someone new, but to become more fully who you already are? Sarah and her friends are rediscovering something that Willem knew intuitively, that apprenticing yourself to wisdom, whether it's the wisdom of clay, of grain, of thread, or of wood, changes you in ways that can't be measured on a resume. It teaches patience in an impatient world, presence in a distracted age, the deep satisfaction of work that connects your hands to your heart. In 1348, when the Black Death swept through Europe, killing a third of the population, something remarkable happened in the guilds that survived. Instead of hoarding resources or competing for the work of the dead, they opened their doors wider. In Florence, the Wool Guild began accepting apprentices from families that had never been able to afford the training. In London, the Carpenters Guild created a fund to support the widows and orphans of members who had died, ensuring that knowledge and craft would continue even when individual lives were cut short. This wasn't charity, it was survival. The guild masters understood something we've forgotten, that in times of crisis, community isn't a luxury but a necessity. The strength of the whole determines the well being of each part. When everyone prospers, you prosper. When everyone suffers, you suffer too. Contrast this with our modern understanding of work, where collaboration is often performative and competition is the underlying reality. We speak of team players while rewarding individual achievement. We celebrate disruption that destroys entire industries and the communities that depended on them. We measure success by how far we rise above others, not by how much we lift each other up. In the guild system, there was no rising above, only growing deeper. Master craftsmen became masters not by competing against other craftsmen, but by mastering themselves. The baker, who could judge the exact moment when bread was perfectly risen, the weaver, who could feel the quality of wool through his fingertips, the carpenter, who could join wood so seamlessly that the joints became invisible. These were the qualities that commanded respect. And here's what we've lost: the understanding that mastery is inherently collaborative. No one becomes a master alone. Willem learned from Henrik, who learned from master before him, in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. Each generation added small improvements, tiny innovations that accumulated like sediment to create traditions of extraordinary depth and resilience. The Guild Workshop was designed for this kind of learning. Apprentices worked alongside masters, absorbing not just techniques, but ways of thinking, ways of problem solving, ways of being in relationship with materials and tools and each other. Knowledge flowed in all directions. Masters learned from apprentices too, seeing familiar techniques through fresh eyes, staying connected to the curiosity and wonder that first drew them to their craft. Modern workplaces often promise this kind of mentorship, but the reality is usually different. Mentorship becomes another task to optimize, another metric to track. The mentor apprentice relationship becomes transactional. I'll teach you what I know if you help me look good to management. The deep, patient work of formation, the slow process of becoming not just skilled but wise, gets lost in quarterly reviews and performance metrics. Yet, there are glimpses of the old way in unexpected places. In the kitchen of a small restaurant in Lyon, where the head chef still teaches young cooks the way his grandfather taught him, not through instruction, but through observation, repetition, and the gradual development of what the French call le coup d'œil, the trained eye that knows without thinking. In the workshop of a violin maker in Cremona, where apprentices spend years learning to see wood grain the way their predecessors did, understanding that each tree contains its own music waiting to be released. These spaces feel different. The air itself seems calmer, more focused. There's less talking and more listening to the materials, to the tools, to the subtle rhythms of craft. Competition dissolves into collaboration, not because it's mandated by management, but because it's the natural outcome of shared devotion to something beautiful and difficult and true. There's a difference between doing the same thing every day and doing the same thing every day with reverence. William understood this distinction in his bones, though he might not have had words for it. Each morning before his shuttle touched the loom, he would run his hands along the wooden frame, not checking for defects, though he might find them, but honoring the tool that would partner with him through the day ahead. This wasn't superstition, it was recognition. The loom was more than a machine. It was a collaborator, seasoned by decades of use, shaped by the hands of masters who had worked it before him. The morning touch was a greeting, a promise, a small ceremony that marked the transition from ordinary time to the sacred time of work. We've lost this understanding of ritual in our rush toward efficiency. We have routines, morning coffee, email check, commute, but these are mechanical habits designed to get us through the day, not to connect us to something larger. A routine is about getting things done. A ritual is about becoming someone worthy of doing them. Consider the tea ceremony in medieval Japan, where Zen monks elevated the simple act of preparing and serving tea into a meditation on presence, beauty, and impermanence. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement meaningful. The goal wasn't to drink tea quickly, but to drink it completely, to be fully present to the warmth of the cup, the aroma of the leaves, the fleeting moment of connection between host and guest. Or think of the Islamic craftsmen of 12th century Cordoba, who began each day's work with a prayer that acknowledged their tools as gifts from Allah, their skills as trusts to be stewarded, their work as a form of worship. The prayer wasn't an interruption of work, but its foundation, a reminder that even the most mundane tasks could be transformed into acts of devotion. Modern life offers us few such transformations. We begin our days by checking phones, subjecting ourselves immediately to the demands and anxieties of a connected world. We eat while working, work while walking, scroll while talking. We've optimized away the spaces between activities, the moments of transition that once allowed us to shift from one mode of being to another. But some people are rediscovering the power of ritual in unexpected places. Dr. James Morrison, a surgeon in Portland, has developed what he calls the pause, a moment of silence before each operation, where he places his hands on the patient and silently acknowledges the trust that's been placed in him. It takes 15 seconds. It changes everything about how he approaches his work. Maria Santos, a teacher in Barcelona, begins each class by having her students take 3 deep breaths together, not for discipline or attention, but for presence. We are not just doing math, she explains. We're gathering ourselves to do math. There's a difference. The difference is in the quality of attention these small rituals create. When Willem touched his loom each morning, he wasn't just going through the motions. He was orienting himself toward the work, preparing his mind and body for the particular kind of focus that weaving required. The ritual created what psychologists now call flow states, moments when the boundary between self and activity dissolves, when work becomes play, when effort becomes effortless. Ancient cultures understood that different types of work required different types of consciousness. The focused attention needed for fine weaving was different from the rhythmic awareness needed for threshing grain, which was different from the patient observation needed for tending animals. Rituals helped people shift between these different modes of being, honoring each type of work with the quality of attention it deserved. We've forgotten this wisdom in our rush to multitask, to optimize, to squeeze maximum productivity from every moment. But our brains haven't forgotten. They still crave the clarity that comes from doing one thing completely, the satisfaction that comes from marking transitions, the peace that comes from moving through work with intention rather than urgency. Willem's shuttle was worn smooth by 20 years of use, its edges rounded by the constant passage of his thumb. It fit his hand like a prayer worn smooth by repetition, like a word that had been spoken so often it had become less sound than meaning. He had carved it himself during his apprenticeship under Master Hendrik's watchful eye, learning that the tool was not separate from the craftsman, but an extension of his body, his intention, his skill. When the shuttle broke, as shuttles sometimes do, Willem didn't simply replace it. He mourned it the way you might mourn a friend. Then he carved another, using the broken shuttle as a template, carrying forward its particular balance, its familiar weight. The new shuttle would take months to feel right in his hand, but eventually it too would become part of him, another limb grown from wood and use and time. This relationship between craftsman and tool is nearly extinct in our world. We buy tools designed for obsolescence, expecting them to break so we can buy newer, better versions. We value tools for their convenience, their efficiency, their ability to make us faster rather than better. We've lost the understanding that tools are partners, not mere instruments, that they shape us even as we shape them. Watch a master carpenter's hands as he selects a chisel. He doesn't grab the first one that fits. He weighs several, feeling for the one that wants to do the work at hand. His fingers know the difference between tools that will fight him and tools that will flow with him. He understands that the relationship between hand and tool is a conversation, not a command. This conversation happens in the body below the level of conscious thought. The potter's hands know when the clay is ready to be shaped, when it needs more water, when it's about to collapse. The baker's fingers can judge the elasticity of dough, the exact moment when kneading should stop. The gardener's palms can feel the moisture level of soil, the readiness of fruit, the hidden strength of a seedling. We've digitized away most of these conversations. We rely on apps to tell us when our bread is done, on GPS to tell us where we are, on algorithms to tell us what we want. Our hands, once our primary tools for understanding the world, have become primarily tools for touching screens. But touch carries information that no screen can convey. The woodworker who runs her hand along a board isn't just checking for smoothness. She's reading the grain, understanding the tree this wood came from, feeling where it wants to split and where it wants to bend. The musician who plays the same instrument for decades develops a relationship with that specific collection of wood and metal and string, learning its quirks and preferences, its moods and possibilities. These relationships take time to develop, years, sometimes decades. They can't be rushed or optimized or disrupted. They require the kind of patience that our culture has almost forgotten, the willingness to grow slowly into mastery rather than demanding instant competence. In his workshop in Kyoto, master carpenter Tsunekazu Nishioka spent 40 years learning to work with wood using only traditional hand tools. He could feel the seasonal changes in timber, knew which trees had grown on which side of the mountain by the way their grain responded to his plane. When asked why he didn't use power tools, he would hold up his hands and say, "These are my computers. They process information that no machine can understand." The guild system understood this wisdom. Apprentices spent years learning to use tools properly, not just efficiently. They learned to maintain them, to repair them, to understand their quirks and capabilities. They learned that a tool was only as good as the relationship between tool and user, that mastery lay not in having the best tools, but in knowing how to collaborate with the tools you had. In Willem's world, time moved differently, not because clocks didn't exist. They did, marking the hours for church services and market openings, but because work time was measured by the rhythm of the craft itself. Cloth couldn't be rushed. Wool demanded its own pace. Threads required their own timing. The weaver who hurried made mistakes that would show in the finished fabric for years to come. This was sacred time, time devoted to the requirements of the work rather than the demands of efficiency. Sacred time moved with the seasons, with the availability of light, with the natural rhythms of materials and bodies. It expanded and contracted like breath, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always appropriate to the task at hand. The guild system protected this sacred time fiercely. Work began at dawn and ended at dusk. not because of labor laws, but because fine work required good light. Markets operated on certain days, not because of convenience, but because buying and selling were understood to be different activities than making, requiring different kinds of attention. Sundays were for rest, not as a reward for productivity, but as a recognition that human beings need regular return to themselves, to their families, to their relationship with the divine. Compare this to our modern relationship with time, where every moment is potentially productive, every pause potentially profitable. We carry our work with us everywhere, accessible through devices that never sleep. We measure our days in meetings and deadlines, our weeks in quarterly goals, our years in career advancement. We speak of time management as if time were a resource to be optimized rather than a medium to be inhabited. But time isn't neutral. Different qualities of time create different qualities of experience, different possibilities for depth and meaning. The frantic time of emergency response creates one kind of consciousness, alert, reactive, focused on immediate solutions. The patient time of craft creates another, contemplative, attentive, focused on long-term excellence. The playful time of celebration creates yet another, joyful, creative, focused on connection and meaning. Traditional cultures understood these different qualities of time and structured their lives accordingly. The Benedictine monks, who preserved learning through the Dark Ages, organized their days around what they called the hours, specific times for prayer, work, study, and rest. Each hour had its own character, its own requirements, its own gifts. Work time wasn't just time spent working, it was time devoted to the transformation of raw materials into something useful and beautiful, a form of prayer expressed through craft. In 14th century Islamic culture, artisans understood the concept of waqt, the right time for each activity. There was a time for learning, a time for practicing, a time for creating, a time for teaching. Master calligraphers would spend hours preparing their ink, not because preparation was separate from the work, but because it was part of the work, a necessary transition into the proper state of mind for creating beauty. We've lost this understanding of time as quality rather than quantity. We try to save time, spend time, make time, as if time were a commodity rather than the very fabric of experience. We multitask, believing we can do more by doing several things at once, not realizing that we're actually doing several things poorly, giving none of them the full attention they deserve. But some people are rediscovering the power of sacred time in their own lives. Chef David Chang describes the moment when he stopped watching the clock and started watching the food, how vegetables looked when they were properly caramelized, how meat felt when it was perfectly cooked, how sauces sounded when they reached the right consistency. The food became his timekeeper, and paradoxically, this made him both slower and more efficient, more present and more productive. Writer Annie Dillard spends hours watching the light change in her study, not because she's procrastinating, but because she's learning to see the way light shapes the words on her page. She understands that writing time isn't just time spent typing, it's time spent in relationship with language, with meaning, with the subtle processes of creation that can't be rushed or forced. The ledger books from Willem's Guild, preserved in the archives of Ypres, tell a story that would confuse any modern business consultant. There are records of cloth sold, yes, but also records of marriages celebrated, apprentices trained, masters buried, widows supported. There are accounts of feast days when no work was done, of guild members who were supported through illness, of techniques shared freely with competing workshops in other towns. By our standards, these guild masters were terrible business people. They prioritized relationships over profit, quality over quantity, community stability over individual advancement. They measured success not in quarterly growth, but in the continuation of their craft, the well being of their members, the reputation of their work across generations. Yet their inefficient system created some of the most beautiful and durable goods in human history. Cloth from the Flemish guilds was prized from London to Constantinople. Italian guild craftsmen created art that still moves us to tears 6 centuries later. German guild metal workers forged tools so well made that they're still in use today, passed down through generations of hands. What the guild masters understood, and what we've forgotten, is that meaning and quality are intimately connected. Work that serves only the bottom line produces goods that serve only the bottom line, functional but forgettable, profitable but disposable. Work that serves a larger purpose, that connects the maker to the user through bonds of responsibility and care, creates something entirely different. Objects that carry the maker's intention, that improve with use, that become more beautiful with age. This isn't romantic nostalgia, it's practical wisdom. When your name and reputation are attached to everything you make, when your neighbors will be using your products for decades, when your children will inherit your trade, and its standing in the community, you make different choices. You use better materials, take more time, pay attention to details that won't be noticed for years but will matter for generations. Modern manufacturing has achieved the opposite: maximum efficiency with minimum attachment. We design products to fail so customers will buy replacements. We maximize profit by minimizing the relationship between maker and user. We measure success by how much we can produce, not by how well we can serve the people who use what we make. But this approach is beginning to show its limits. Consumers are increasingly seeking products with stories, with meaning, with connections to the people who made them. The craft movement, the farm to table movement, the slow fashion movement, all of these represent a hunger for goods that carry intention, that connect us to something larger than the transaction itself. Sarah, the software engineer we met earlier, has begun applying guild principles to her day job. Instead of measuring her success by lines of code written or features shipped, she measures it by the problems solved, the users helped, the colleagues mentored. She takes time to understand the real needs her software serves, to build relationships with the people who will use it, to create code that's not just functional, but elegant, maintainable, worthy of the time and attention it demands. Her managers don't always understand this approach. They prefer metrics that can be tracked and compared, goals that can be achieved and exceeded. But Sarah's work speaks for itself. Her code breaks less often, requires less maintenance, serves users better. Her colleagues seek her out for advice, not because she's the most productive programmer, but because she's the most thoughtful one. This is the difference between work that serves metrics and work that serves meaning. Metrics answer the question, how much? Meaning answers the question, how well and for whom and why. A life organized around metrics becomes a series of achievements to be unlocked, goals to be reached, numbers to be improved. A life organized around meaning becomes a deepening relationship with craft, community, and purpose. When harvest failed in the countryside around Ypres Sais in 1346, the price of food in the markets tripled overnight. Merchants from other regions arrived with carts full of grain, eager to profit from the shortage. But Willem and his fellow guild members barely noticed the price changes. Their bread came from the same baker who had always supplied them, at the same price he had always charged. When Master Henrique asked why he wasn't raising his prices like everyone else, the baker looked puzzled. "These are my people," he said. "Why would I profit from their hunger?" This was a moral economy, a system where relationships and responsibilities mattered more than market forces, where the well being of the community took precedence over individual profit. The baker understood that his prosperity was inseparable from the prosperity of his neighbors, that a community impoverished by price gouging would eventually be unable to support anyone. Such thinking seems naive to our modern sensibilities. We've been taught that markets are neutral, that supply and demand are natural forces like gravity or weather. We accept that prices should fluctuate based on scarcity, that profit maximization is not just acceptable, but necessary for economic health. We've made a virtue of competition and a science of self interest. But the guild system reveals a different possibility. Markets embedded in moral relationships, trade governed by mutual obligation, profit constrained by community welfare. This wasn't socialism or charity, it was a recognition that sustainable prosperity requires sustainable communities, that businesses that destroy their social environment ultimately destroy themselves. Consider the Islamic concept of haram and halal in commerce. Not just what is forbidden and permitted, but what is harmful and beneficial to the community as a whole. Medieval Islamic merchants understood that certain types of profit were toxic, that speculation and hoarding and exploitation might generate wealth in the short term, but would undermine the social fabric that made trade possible in the long term. Or think of the Japanese concept of sanpoyoshi: good for the seller, good for the buyer, good for society. This wasn't just a nice sentiment, but a practical business philosophy, a recognition that transactions have effects beyond the immediate parties involved, that sustainable business requires sustainable communities. The guild system institutionalized these principles. Guild rules limited profit margins, controlled working conditions, ensured fair wages, and maintained quality standards. Members who violated these rules faced not just financial penalties, but social exclusion, the loss of their place in the community that gave their work meaning. This created what economists call thick markets, markets where participants have ongoing relationships, where reputation matters more than price, where trust is more valuable than immediate profit. In thick markets, cheating is expensive because it destroys the relationships that make future trade possible. Quality is valuable because it builds the reputation that brings future customers. Modern markets, by contrast, are often thin, dominated by one-time transactions between strangers, where price matters more than relationship, where the goal is to extract maximum value from each exchange. In thin markets, cheating is cheap because you'll never see the customer again. Quality is expensive because it costs more than necessary to complete the transaction. But we're beginning to see the limits of thin markets. Environmental destruction, social inequality, the erosion of community bonds. These are all symptoms of economic systems that prioritize efficiency over sustainability profit over relationships, growth over well being. Some modern businesses are rediscovering the wisdom of oral economies. Patagonia builds environmental responsibility into its business model, accepting lower profits in exchange for sustainable practices. The Grameen Bank extends credit based on social relationships rather than financial assets, understanding that community bonds can be more valuable than collateral. Local food cooperatives prioritize relationships with farmers and customers over profit margins, creating what economist Herman Daly calls the economics of enough. These businesses understand what the guildmasters knew, that true prosperity isn't just about having more, but about having enough sustainably in relationship with others who also have enough. They measure success not just by financial returns, but by their impact on the communities they serve, the environment they operate in, the future they're creating for the next generation. The sun is setting now over the imaginary Ypres where Willem finished his day's work. His hands, stained with dye and worn smooth by 20 years of the same motions, rest quietly in his lap as he walks home through streets that know his name. The cloth he wove today will become a merchant's cloak, a mother's dress, a child's blanket. But Willem doesn't know this, and doesn't need to. He knows only that he has done his work well, that his place in the great web of making and using and caring is secure. Tomorrow he will wake before dawn and touch his loom and begin again. Not because he has to, but because this is who he is, a weaver, a guild member, a person whose life has weight and meaning because it serves something larger than himself. The thought of disrupting this rhythm, of optimizing it or scaling it or pivoting to something more profitable, would strike him as absurd. He has found his place in the world. Why would he want to leave it? We have been telling ourselves a story about progress, about growth, about the necessity of constant change. We have convinced ourselves that standing still is stagnation, that depth is less valuable than breadth, that the old ways are obstacles to overcome rather than wisdom to preserve. But what if we've been wrong? What if the guild masters knew something we've forgotten about what it means to live a meaningful life? The answer isn't to recreate the medieval world. We can't and shouldn't. The guild system had its own forms of exclusion, its own limitations, its own shadows. But we can learn from its insights about work and community, about the relationship between maker and user, about the possibility of organizing economic life around something other than maximum efficiency and endless growth. We can begin small with our own days, our own work, our own relationships. We can ask different questions. Instead of, how can I do this faster? We can ask, how can I do this better? Instead of, how can I get ahead? We can ask, how can we succeed together? Instead of, what's the most efficient way? We can ask, what's the most meaningful way? Sarah, the software engineer, has begun what she calls guild mornings, an hour before work when she reviews the code she wrote the day before, not to find bugs but to understand it more deeply, to see how it connects to the larger system, to take pride in work well done. It's not efficient, but it's transformative. It changes her relationship to her work from something she does to something she is. Marcus, the baker, has started sharing his knowledge freely with other home bakers, not because he wants to create competition, but because he wants to create community. He understands that his craft is larger than his individual success, that it needs many hands to keep it alive, to keep it growing, to keep it meaningful. These small acts of resistance against the tyranny of optimization are like seeds scattered in fertile ground. They grow slowly, but they grow. They spread not through force, but through example, through the quiet demonstration that another way is possible. The guildmasters understood something we're only beginning to remember, that the goal of a life isn't to maximize output, but to maximize meaning, not to do more, but to do better, not to have everything, but to have enough. They understood that true prosperity comes not from accumulating more, but from deepening relationships with our work, with our communities, with our tools, with our time. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider this. What would it feel like to wake up tomorrow knowing that your work mattered, that your community needed you, that your skills were valued, not for their market price, but for their contribution to something larger than yourself? What would it feel like to move through your day with the rhythm of ritual rather than the chaos of constant change? Perhaps Willem's boring day wasn't boring at all. Perhaps it was what peace looks like in a world that has forgotten how to be still. Perhaps the most radical thing we can do in our age of endless distraction is to find our looms, touch them with reverence, and begin the ancient work of weaving our lives into something beautiful and whole. The shuttles are waiting, the threads are ready. The only question is whether we have the courage to slow down long enough to remember who we are beneath all the noise of who we think we should become. Sleep well. Tomorrow's work will wait for you, patient as wool, steady as stone, ready to receive whatever care you're willing to give.